Today's presentation will be given by Ezra Vogel. He's the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences, Emeritus at Harvard. After graduating from Ohio Wesleyan in 1950 and serving 2 years in the U.S. Army, he studied sociology in the Department of Social Relations at Harvard. He received his PhD in 1958. He then went to Japan for 2 years to study the Japanese language and conduct research interviews with middle-class families. From 1961 to 1964, he was a postdoc fellow at Harvard studying Chinese language and history, and he remained at Harvard, becoming a lecturer in 1964 and in 1967 a professor. He retired from teaching in 2000. In 1987, at the invitation of the Guangdong provincial government, he spent 8 months studying the economic and social progress of Guangdong as it pioneered economic reform beginning in 1978. The results are reported in One Step Ahead in China, Guangdong Under Reform, which was published in 1989. His Reischauer lectures were published as The Four Little Dragons, The Spread of Industrialization in East Asia in 1991, and the Chinese edition of his book on Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China, which was published in 2011, has sold over 700,000 copies the first year after publication in China. He has visited East Asia every summer since 1958, and he has spent a total of over 6 years in Asia. He lectures frequently in Asia in both Chinese and Japanese. Today he will be speaking in English, I think, on Deng Xiaoping and his legacy. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm an ancient citizen, as you can guess from that. So I'm going to take the liberty of sitting down. I hope you can hear what I have to say. What I plan to do is run through a series of pictures to sort of give a sense of Deng as a person. Those of you who read my book will have to bear with me as I repeat many of the things you already know. And then the second thing, I will talk about his personal legacy, and then finally say something about how I see this in relation to his current the current issues around Xi Jinping. First of all, I want to say why I'm so happy to be here today. First of all, Mary didn't mention my secret, and that is in the summer of 1950, to graduate from Ohio Wesleyan, I attended summer school at the University of Michigan. So I always enjoy coming back here. Then in the 80s, I consider this one of the great, probably the greatest contemporary China center. And I had a lot of contact with people like Don Monroe and Al Feuerwerker and Mike Oxenberg and Eckstein and Dernberger. And it was a wonderful, exciting period. And I got to take part in a lot of that. And one of the persons who was here for a number of years, Marty White, was a student of mine. So I took a special interest. And third, because I know Mary and others here now have a very exciting program, and you have a very lively, interesting group of students, and it's always fun for somebody who cares a lot about his subject to have a chance to interact with people who also care a lot about those things. Now I'll sit down and tell you what my quick overview of Deng is. I served 2 years in Washington, and there one of the lessons I learned is that you had to write a one-page summary of what you had to say. And I thought that was way too brief. And first of all, I thought the sound bites. But then I thought it's an interesting intellectual exercise to try to say what's the most important thing. And so what I've done, even though I only talk about Deng for maybe 20 minutes or so, I tried to select what I thought are things that would best tell the story and select pictures that I thought best tell a story. My work on Deng is not exactly a biography. It's Deng and his era. And therefore, I didn't go into as much detail about his early life. I tried to learn as much as I could so that I could select out the most important things to tell a story, to give an idea about where he was coming from and how he developed. But the book really concentrates, and my own study really concentrates on what he did when he came back in 1978 well, he came back in 77, and then 78 when he assumed the top leadership position. As you know, he fell from power 3 different times. This is better?
It's hard to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Nina's taken wonderful care of me, and so that the first thing I would say about his early background that's important, he came from a small landlord family in Sichuan, and it's an area uphill from Chengdu and Chongqing, but it's close enough that there were rivers that connected down to Chongqing, so that you had good transport. So it was not an isolated mountain village. It was one that was far enough apart that it had its own separate village, and yet his father was able to keep in contact with the broader trends that were taking place in Chengdu and Chongqing, of course, being on the Yangtze, was in touch with Shanghai and the outside world. So it was one where he was aware of the world. And at age 15 already, he was at one of the progressive schools. He started in a Confucian school for a year or two, so he had a little bit of background and sense of what the Confucian training was, but then went to a school that tried to introduce modern subjects. And at age 15, as a precocious young man, he was already on the streets in 1919 at the May 4th campaign, so that he already took part in nationalistic programs, and when I was earlier in my career, when I was working on psychology, Eric Erikson talked about how some people's professional and personal identity takes place just at the same time. So as a teenager, his intense personal identity was very much linked up with his role in trying to help change China. The first picture we have of Deng that has remained is when he was 16, when he arrived in France. And when he was 15, his father got him into this special preparatory school in Chongqing to spend a year getting ready to go abroad. In those days, very few Chinese had the opportunity to go abroad. It's not like the current period where some 235,000 Chinese students are in the United States and plenty are in Europe, all over other countries. There were two main countries where students went abroad in the early 1920s. One was Japan and one was France. And the reason it worked out in France is that during World War I, the French had imported a lot of workers from China, industrial workers, and they could get good jobs. And because Chinese money did not go very far those days, even the people who came from landlord and merchant families did not have enough really to support their children's full education abroad. So some leading people in China got the idea of having half study, half work, so they could work in factories and earn enough money so that they could study. And that's what Deng was sent at. So you had to be very smart. And you look at this early group of Chinese communist youth. In those days, of course, up until 1927 was still the United Front period within China. So there was no split during the time he was there between those who went to the Kuomintang and those who went to the communists. They were together, although there were different views. It was not a split. And he was with the more radical, and some people, including Deng, were active both in the Kuomintang and in the communist student movement, and this communist student movement was much more to the left. And these people, if you look at them, they don't look like they just came off the streets. They're not street bums. So the interesting thing is they were identifying with proletariat, with worker, but nearly all of them came from landlord and merchant families, because to get an education and prepared to go to France at that time, you had to have that. Why did they identify with those workers? Why did they identify with the proletariat class? Well, for one thing, it was 1920 when he went, and this is the early 20s, and the Russian Revolution had taken place in 1917, and seemed like a very promising way to go. Here was a backward country that was beginning to get organized and move ahead, and it was concerned with the common people. And these youth in France also felt that in order to promote modern development, you had to have a very broad movement, and most of the people were workers, and so they identified with a communist party. Of course, at that time, there were only a few thousand Chinese students who were abroad at all, and there were something like 3,000 or 4,000 who were in France. And after 1949, there were so few educated people in the communist leadership that this group, who had been in France together, actually played quite a bit important role. In the center, you see the Zhou Enlai, who was just a few years older than Deng Xiaoping, who was already the leader of this group of leftist youth in France. And at the far left, you see Nie Rongzhen, who later was not only a general, but also played a key role in scientific development, and particularly advanced nuclear and missile development in China, played a very key role in scientific development. And just to the right of Zhou Enlai, as you look at him, is Li Fuchun, who played a key role in working out the first 5-year plan and in economic development. And way back in the last row, there's Deng Xiaoping. So it was really quite an important group. Under communism, people sometimes ask me what I think about the factions. And I don't think that's the right way to talk about things in a communist organization, because they hated factionalism. And if 2 or 3 people met together, and as they said in Chinese, 有组织有计划, they were criticized and knocked down. And so you could not have a separate faction that operated separately. It wasn't like that. But what you had was something like an affinity. So people who had similar experience of yours, you could talk to them in a way of have deep understanding, and you could have work units that work together. But this group of French-educated Chinese, they were not a clique, and they were not a separate organization. But at key times, they could operate as an affinity group. As when Deng was criticized the very first time in Jiangxi Soviet period, he was very much helped out by Li Fuchun, who had been in France with him, and obviously considered him one of his best friends. Because Li Fuchun at that time was head of the provincial party committee and got Deng out of trouble. Now, after, let's see, I'm going to skip now way up until after 1949. Of course, Deng served 12 years in the army, and the army experience was very important. Of course, he was a political commissar, and he was matched with Liu Bocheng, who had a great deal of military ability and training in military academies. And because they worked together so long, Deng knew a lot about military campaigns too. He was involved in them, and even though he was a political commissar, he had to know about the overall military strategy and military activity. Sometime one foreigner asked him what his occupation was, and he said, "Chobalu," which is, I'm just a hick of a soldier. That's my real occupation. But I think if you look about the kind of organization that Deng believed in, a well-disciplined one where people listened to orders, where you had a chief of staff person who would be responsible for directions and then responsible for the overall concrete implementation of activities, both for the anti-Japanese war when they were guerrillas, and for the later period when they became regular army. they played a very key role. So then in 1949 and 1952, Deng was in charge of the Southwest Bureau of the 6 provinces in the Southwest, so that he had a lot of local experience. If you think about the way we Americans select our presidents, they're very often people who've worked in Congress, in which case they have familiarity with national policy, or they've been governors and had local experience, but not often they've had both. But Deng was one who had both. He had that experience when he was in the Army in the anti-Japanese war. He was in the Taihang area and was, in a sense, kind of a political leader of that area. He had been in the Jiangxi Soviet. He had already been in charge of Ruijin County, and in the Southwest he was in charge of 6 provinces. So he had a very strong local administrative experience. Then after 1952, when Mao centralized leadership from the 6 administrative regions into Beijing and brought in a lot of those people who had been leaders in the regions, Deng was made Secretary General of the party, and by 1956, after the 8th Party Congress, he became the General Secretary of the party. So he had, from 56 to 66, 10 years of experience leading the party. And during that time, he also acquired a lot of understanding of foreign developments. Here's a picture where he went with Mao in 1957 to the Soviet Union. And that was the time when Mao pointed to him and said, "See that little guy? He has a great future." And so it was understood that even though Liu Shaoqi was officially the heir, that if Deng was in this small group of people who might become heirs to Mao, it's clear, and many people thought that, if anything, he was the top candidate to be the real successor. So Mao shared with him a lot of information that was going on. So if you put it in American terms, it's as if somebody served in the White House for a number of years at a young stage and therefore got familiar with the overall policy of the very top leaders. Here is Deng going to argue with the Soviet Union in 1963. He was sent at the airport, and you see they're seeing him off are Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi, and I think it's Peng Zhen in the back over there to the right, to your right, and those people seeing him off. As you know, Deng Xiaoping was only 5 feet tall. Some people said he was only really 4 feet 11, but claimed to be 5 feet tall. But if you look at him, you don't see the sense that he was suffered from an inferiority complex. He's going off with a lot of confidence. He'd been a soldier, he'd been a leader in important positions. Mao thought very well of him. This, to me, is a very poignant turning point. This is in 1974. At that time, Zhou Enlai was already sick with cancer, and in addition, he had a political sickness. Mao thought he had been too soft in dealing with Kissinger in the United States, and was very suspect of him. And since mainland China took the UN seat in 1971, Mao wanted to have a representative present the Chinese foreign policy to the UN. And for various reasons, it got postponed until 1974. And of course, the person who should have done that with all the foreign policy experiences was Zhou Enlai. But because Zhou Enlai had a physical sickness and also a political sickness, and because Deng had been so tough in fighting the Soviets, Mao was confident that Deng could play that role. And so here is Zhou Enlai at the airport, seeing off Deng, whom they had known each other way back in France and seen each other work together in Beijing in the 50s. And here, in a sense, Zhou Enlai is transferring to Deng the responsibility for dealing with foreign policy and for being the person in charge. Deng visited him often in the hospital afterwards for the next 2 years while Zhou was still alive, but basically it was Deng, who was in charge of foreign policy. So it gives us all background because it shows that when Deng came to power in 1978 at the third plenum, he had a lot of experience in the military. He had been abroad 5 years in France, 1 year in the Soviet Union. He had had local leadership experience. He had had national leadership experience. And he had been in charge of foreign policy. So if you're trying to think of how to prepare somebody for leadership, that was really quite an extraordinary combination of background before he took that. Here is Deng talking to the UN. Here he's up close. And he met Kissinger for the first time at this trip. Kissinger at the time said that Deng seemed to be on a training mission. Kissinger enjoyed working with Zhou Enlai so much and thought he was the consummate diplomat and wise person, and that Deng was not very experienced compared to Zhou Enlai when he first met him. They joked that it was not convenient for Kissinger to meet Deng when he came to China before that time. Of course, Deng had been sent down to Jiangxi during the Cultural Revolution, was not available. So the first time he met Kissinger was this time. But I think Kissinger's criticism is not entirely fair because Deng was very concerned about Mao being very angry at Zhou Enlai and being very tough. And after all, Deng had also been criticized in the Cultural Revolution in 1966, had been drug out along with Liu Shaoqi, and now he was allowed to come back, but Mao was still looking at him pretty carefully. So Deng felt it was better to be cautious and not be too much of a wise guy. And so I think Kissinger did not really fully understand that context in his judgment. Now I'm skipping up to 1977. As you know, when Deng was criticized in late 75 and early 1976, Mao was already on his deathbed. Zhou Enlai had died in January 1976, and then Mao died that September 76. And after January, Deng was basically criticized, and Mao decided that Hua Guofeng should be the successor rather than Deng Xiaoping. And so from the time of April 1976 until Mao died a few months later, Deng was already completely out of it. And that meant that after Mao's death, Hua Guofeng was the general secretary, and Deng was still on his way to coming back and had not really returned. Now this year is, as you probably know, is the 110th anniversary of Deng's birth, and I went to China for those celebrations and took part in some of those discussions, and they have a 44-part series of dramatized of Deng's life that had been shown in commemoration, and one of the things they emphasize very much in that is his return. In my view, Hua Guofeng was not really so much against reform as he was criticized for. I think there is a certain kind of tradition in China where the person who wins a battle is seen as the moral person, the correct person, and the person before is evil and dumb and did all the wrong things. And I think there was a little bit of that in the way the transition was handled after Deng came to power, replacing Hua Guofeng in December 1978. But as I go through the records that I have seen, I think, in fact, that Hua Guofeng was more in favor of reform and opening than he's given credit for. And I think people like Warren Sun in Australia, who are now writing about this, will tell the story more completely. But I think that while Hua Guofeng did not have the military experience, didn't have foreign policy experience, he didn't have the leadership strengths that Deng did, and the experience and the contacts and determination, I think that probably it would be better to see Hua Guofeng as a good provincial figure who didn't quite have the qualities to be the top leader at a very critical turning point in Chinese history. Anyhow, Hua Guofeng allows Deng to return to work in the summer of 1977. And Deng volunteers at that time as this new movie that's memorializing his life talks about. Deng said, you know, for the country to move ahead economically, we need to have, first of all, science, technology, and education. And that's what I want to volunteer for. He was at that time under the leadership of Hua Guofeng. And so he didn't want to challenge Hua Guofeng, at least right away. And so he volunteered for science technology. And he argued that for development of all the four modernizations, science, agriculture, industry, national defense, science, technology, education, that it's the science, technology, education that's most important. If you get that right, then the other four modernizations could follow. So he had this forum immediately after he came back discussing the educational situation. Of course, most universities have been closed down for 10 years, and they were in a mess. And Deng says, can we have entrance examinations this year? And they said, it's very difficult. They talked about all the difficulties. And then Deng finally said, can we have it? Is it possible? They said, well, it would be possible. And he says, we're going to do it. And that determination to open the universities right away and to have entrance examinations was a very critical decision, I think, in laying the base for the modernization that began after December 1978. And so after December 1978, he was able already to have a number of students who were in universities. And in the entrance examinations that took place the end of 77, school was delayed a little bit that year because it couldn't get everything quite ready right in time. At that point, the education was to be based the entrance examinations were to be based entirely on merit. And that's fundamentally different from Mao, because Mao wanted to have people from the right class background, and if not the right class background, at least the right class attitudes. And they had to have the right standpoint, the liqiang. They had to have the right political coloration. But Deng felt that by 1977, that there was no landlord class and there was no bourgeois class, and that any Chinese who had the ability should be allowed to attend universities. And so it was strictly based on merit, and the merit was introduced, and then people were studied and the universities reopened, expanded them. Deng made a point of learning about science around the world, and one of the advantages, of course, that a Chinese leader had that leaders in many different countries didn't have was that there were many Chinese who had studied abroad, ethnic Chinese, who were around the world. And at the time, 77, 78, when China was getting started in reform and opening, there were 3 Chinese Americans who had won the Nobel Prize. One of them was Yang Zhenning. One of them was Professor Samuel Ding of MIT. One of them was Li Yanzi, Li Zhengdao, really a pair of them at Columbia. Deng saw them not just once, saw them many times. And he saw many other Chinese intellectuals because he believed that raising educational standards was so important to the effort of modernizing. And he wanted to get people prepared intellectually for what they were to face. One thing that, of course, Deng couldn't do this alone, and although my book centers around one person, it was important to have a high enough awareness of what was needed for reform and opening in top circles. And I was surprised as I got into this, that not more Westerners studying China had given more attention to the Gumu delegation of 1978. There were several delegations that were sent abroad in '78 to Japan and to Hong Kong and other places. But by far the most important was the Gumu delegation, where it was very much, those of you who study Japanese history and know about the Iwakura mission, it was very much like the Iwakura mission, only in small. The Iwakura mission took 21 months. This was only 5 weeks, but it was by airplane, and it was very much the same kind of composition, different ministries and different areas of technology, and they studied various things in Europe, and they went to Switzerland, France, Germany, Holland, and Belgium. Oops. Then in '78, at the Party Work Conference, where they had a chance to discuss some of the big issues that were facing China at that time, there are a number of leaders who decided that Hua Guofeng wasn't up to the task and that Deng Xiaoping ought to become the major leader. And so Deng was allowed to return at the 1978, the third plenum that everybody talks about as the beginning of opening and reform. And the person who was there with him was Chen Yun. And although Deng was allowed to be the top leader, a lot of the leaders of the party at that time felt that the problems with the failures of the Great Leap and the Cultural Revolution was not just that Mao made errors, but the party did not allow enough freedom of discussion and did not allow enough different viewpoints to be heard, so that they didn't make the correction. And they didn't want Deng to be so strong and so centralized. They wanted centralized leadership, but not so strong that they couldn't voice opposition. And so they decided that he would not be called premier. He was deputy premier. He was not chairman. He was deputy chairman. And in a sense, Chen Yun, who is roughly his equal in terms of party experience. In fact, if anything, had had higher positions even earlier than Deng, and was widely respected. The only one who had really comparable respect within the party, in a sense, had a veto power. And I think it was probably a good experience, because a good arrangement, because Deng, if anything, was a bit of a hasty person. He wanted to move fast. He was a general, and he often got the troops out and was ready to go right away. He's the kind of leader, when there were doubts and questions, he was ready to march ahead because he thought that was basically good. Chen Yun was a more cautious type who had been in charge of the details of 5-year planning and wanted to go through all the details before they tried to move. Well, that's the end of my slideshow, and I probably talked longer on that than I should have to give you enough idea about what he. Can I turn this off now? You know, or some way to. Anyhow, just turn it off, or can I do? Maybe you can do that for me. But let me just now say what I think are the big changes, the legacy that's most important that Deng left. First of all, he led the transition from a revolutionary party to one that was a ruling party. And Mao still wanted to carry on class warfare. He still wanted to carry on struggle. And he still carried about political standpoint. Deng wanted to put it on a basic administrative area, on a basis and a pragmatic basis. In the 1950s, Mao, if anything, was the dreamer who sat in the background, and Deng was on the front lines where he was responsible for administration. And so he tried to do what he could in a pragmatic way. He also, as I say, introduced entrance examinations and tried to make merit the criteria, not only for educational background, but also for promotion. And he tried to raise the level of cadres, and those who didn't have a college education and wanted to go higher up had to find some way to getting an equivalent of a university education in order to get higher positions, and then in the long run to have a situation where all the top leaders had quite broad and high-level educational experience. He also wanted to really study from abroad. It was, of course, during the 50s, Mao had sent some people to Eastern Europe and Russia for a study, but Deng wanted to do it on a massive scale. And he knew that would be disruptive to things at home, but he was willing to do it. He wanted to get the best ideas anywhere around the world, and people should go and learn as much as they could. He also wanted to have good relations with the major powers. And he took the steps that were necessary to normalize relations with the United States. Even though Nixon had visited in 72, when Deng came to power in 78, he was just able to complete the normalization he had been in charge of foreign policy since he returned in mid-77 and had helped arrange what was necessary in the negotiations so that they could normalize relations. That enabled him to visit the United States in January 79 and to develop much deeper relations with the United States. So the important thing to Deng was not worrying about little land borders and things like that, but having good relationship with major powers. And that was part of his policy, and he succeeded. Of course, he was helped at the time by the Cold War situation where the United States and Europe and Japan were united against the Soviet Union, but he took full advantage of that and therefore had developed good relations with the major powers. He did not really develop military to a big way. He felt that civilian economy had to be developed first, and it was only in 1998, after he passed away, that Jiang Zemin really began to expand the military, because that was the important thing for development, in Deng's view, was domestic development. So I think those are the outlines of the major legacy that Deng had. One other important thing, of course, is he was authoritarian and wanted the Communist Party to be in charge and did not want full-level democracy. He put down student demonstrations in 1986, and he put down the demonstrations in a bloody way in 1989. And he wanted to have a tightly disciplined order. He was worried that the country was too loose, that ever since the Opium War, things had been too disorganized, and you needed a strong, tight leadership, and you still needed a propaganda department, and you should not allow too much freedom. You had to allow some freedom for criticism, but it's very much in the line of democratic centralism, where you have a strong central power and you have some ideas. It's okay to present ideas within the context of party power, and then you follow the leader. So I think that was the basic legacy. Now, what does this have to do with Xi Jinping? And when I was in China talking about Deng in August, many people asked me, since Xi Jinping had visited the site of Deng Xiaoping in Shenzhen to show the favored reform and was using the big series of dramatized incidents of Deng's life, is Xi Jinping the new leader? Is he stronger than Deng? Is he as strongest since Deng? I would say in several ways Deng was better prepared for leadership. He had had more foreign experience. Xi Jinping, after all, had not studied in the days when China was open. He did not have experience abroad, and the universities and the Cultural Revolution were not ones that gave him contact with foreigners. So he didn't have that historical depth of understanding of foreign policy, nor of the military that Deng had. And in my view, when Deng came to power, he had to make fundamentally different structure that introduced the opening of the market and the meritocracy and the end of revolution. And that, in my view, Xi Jinping has to operate within that structure. But Xi Jinping is trying to be a strong leader, like Deng. And when he uses Deng as a model, I think what he's aiming for is somebody who was a strong leader, who was bold in taking action, who had centralized power and authority, and who was very pragmatic and wanted to do what was necessary to keep the country in good shape. But in some ways, of course, there are fundamental changes that have taken place since Deng. One is the growth and the power of the country, the fact that China is now a strong, rich country, and that now that there are reasons to argue that China could do much more. It has a much stronger military following the 1998 developments that began with Jiang Zemin. And it's now a global power with global reach. So we have a very different country, but in my view, the new leader is very much operating within the range of the legacy from Deng Xiaoping. I've talked a little too long, but I think we got a little time for questions. Thank you very much. Should I just field my own, Mary? Sure. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to answer that. My strategy was to have it translated and published in Hong Kong first. And because Hong Kong, it was completely translated. And my thought was that some copies would get into China and that people could answer on the net. And it would make it more difficult for people in China who wanted to talk about the book to completely ignore what I had said in the book. Then my Hong Kong publisher, Chinese University Press at Hong Kong, gave me very good advice. The woman who's head of the press, Gan Qi, had a bookstore in China after she graduated Peking University and knew all the key players. And she said, narrowed the publishers down to several for me to talk to. And the book had already gotten some attention in English, so there were a lot of publishers in China who wanted to do it. And I did interviews with two, finally, Renmin of Shanghai and Sanlian. And I decided on Sanlian. I liked everything I knew about them. I thought they were a very respectable publisher. And they sent two people down to Hong Kong to talk to me about the arrangements and what kind of agreements. And we reached basically an agreement to go ahead with Sanlian. And the agreement was that I would allow changes, but that I had, if we're going to come under my name, I wanted to see all the changes that they had made. So over the course of 6 or 8 months, some editors at Sanlian went through, and what they did is they Xeroxed a copy of a page, and then they circled the changes they wanted to make, and then they sent it to me for my approval. And they changed about 5%. And the ones to me, it was no issue. Some of my American friends felt that if they can't do the whole thing, you don't do anything. But that's not dealing with China as it is. And so what I did when I went through there, I accepted the ones where they say, for example, during the 1989, they didn't want the names of too many people, particularly the people who are still alive, who have relatives who are still alive. They didn't want their names in there as somebody part of the crackdown. So I could say leaders decided, but I would not say Li Peng decided. And I accepted that. On some things, they on Mao, in English, I had said something like Mao had paranoid fear that some people might be trying to grasp for power and take over. And Mao Zedong made mistakes, but please do not say paranoid. So I took out paranoid. And in the I did some bargaining with him, and at one time during the Great Leap Forward, I had an original thing. I'd said something, an estimated 40 million people had died or something. I forget exactly what I said, but that spirit. And they just took that out. And then I said, look, I'm not going to accept that. And what can we do? And the guy comes up with the suggestion, okay, let's say some foreigners have estimated that as many as 40 million people died, and we put that in. So I was I thought that was great. I mean, to me, it's dealing with the real situation in China and getting as much in as you could. And when the book came out, my Chinese friends in Beijing felt that there was a more detailed explanation of the June 4th than there had been by any other book by a Chinese author, and that I was allowed to do that. And a Hong Kong Chinese reporter wrote up an article, which I think is very accurate, and said that this book was allowed to talk about it in more detail, and it was kind of a breakthrough. And if you, some of my friends who go to bookstores in China say that if you look at the book, it pops open to June 4th. So the people standing, reading the book look at the part on June 4th. So some of my American critics have felt that I didn't talk that much about June 4th. But I think if you look at the book, it talks about, I try to explain why some people criticize Deng in great detail, and that it's all there, and that it was used to be more critical of Deng's actions at the June 4th than had been allowed published before. Yes?
Do you believe that Deng is actually pragmatic rather than true believers in communism? The communists started 打土豪,分田地. Now the DG core in China is 14 to 0.6. The country with the class differentiation is so high, so low, it surpassed America. Do you think that Deng actually, he knew that don't happen, the communists will go to the other side, the opposite as they started?
I think that Deng believed that the Communist Party was the only party that was capable of leading China, and that until his death, he believed that the Communist Party was necessary to provide leadership. But as far as Marxism, Leninism is concerned, I don't think that was important to Deng. In the after 1978, when he was trying to get China moving, he wanted cadres who will do things. And at that time, the mood was that so many cadres had been criticized in the Cultural Revolution, they were afraid to speak out. So they didn't want to say anything. And he wanted people who would boldly try things. So as his speeches, 希望那个干部敢做, that was over and over again. 领导办事要敢做. Now, if you had been too tough on those cadres and said any little thing you do, you could be criticized, they wouldn't be so active. And so I think it's true that in the early 1980s, he allowed them and was not tough on them when they would put a little money in their own pocket. He felt that that was a necessary evil to get things going. I think if he were alive, in the last 10 years, he would see that this has gotten way too far, and that it had become a political problem, and that he would try to curb those people who had made too much money. And I think he personally lived a relatively plain life, and I think that he felt it was no necessary to live such a luxurious life and would have been against it. But it is true that the things he did of opening the markets allowed some people to get rich. And when I went back this year, he was criticized by some people on the left and some people on the right. He's criticized on the left because, after all, the opposition in 1949 to the capitalists, the bourgeois who were exploiting the people, a lot of those things you could say is true of China today. And they feel that he didn't do enough to preserve the spirit of cooperativeness and dedication. and that he allowed the selfishness to go too strong. So I think the people now who talk about the first 17 years and who praise Mao, they do not praise Mao for the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. They praise him because he was still opposed to that exploitation, that the selfish mood that is so powerful in China today. Deng is criticized from the right because he didn't allow freedom. He was too tough in Tiananmen, and he should have done more, and that his successors are not doing more, and that Deng left that legacy. So I think the dominant mood in China today is to be thankful that Deng led them for reform and opening, got the country started. But there are lots of critics on both sides now who feel that China is not where it should be, and that they want to make changes. Yeah, so many hands, I don't know where to go. All right, you. Yes.
Yes. Well, when I'm in China discussing politics and history with taxi drivers,
I have those
ask
too.
them if they think that Deng will ever be regarded to be a greater leader than Mao. And I've surveyed dozens of them, and they all, without a pause, tell me that I'm crazy. It's an idiotic question, and Mao is definitely the superior leader, the man who had the greatest impact on China. And I was just wondering how you would judge the two.
That's not been my experience. There are people who believe that Mao is greatest, but I've run into a lot who feel that he made mistakes in the Great Leap Forward, and that he was too tough on cadres and people starved, and they're very thankful that Deng Xiaoping put him on the correct road. So it is true that there is an aura of Mao. A lot of people still hold up Mao. But once I get into talking to people about what actually happened, my experience has been that they realize the weaknesses of Mao as a leader, and that they appreciate what Deng did in reform and opening. So we've met some different taxi drivers, I think. Yes.
So as we know, there was a broad discussion throughout the whole Chinese society before the reform and opening policy came out, and in late 1970s. So, but now we also meet a bottleneck of reform, and especially the political reform and law reform. So, do you think there will be another similar broad discussion throughout the whole Chinese society, or do you think is it necessary to have this similar broad discussion so that the other reform can come out?
I share the worries of many of my Chinese friends now, that there's a clampdown on freedom of expression and of ideas that has not allowed a broad enough discussion. And my own guess is that Xi Jinping is very worried about this effort to get control over corruption, because that means an awful lot of officials are going to be criticized, and a lot of them are going to be worried that they or their relatives might be in trouble. So it's a very tense situation until he makes more progress. I think if he can consolidate his control over the corruption issue, and there has been a lot of progress already, as you know. You don't go to luxurious banquets, and people are worried about being photographed with the wrong, eating too much or dropping their school kids off in a Mercedes-Benz. There really is a difference, and the luxury shops are not selling as much. There is a difference. And I think that now Xi Jinping has to worry so much about tension from all these leaders who still might be criticized. It's a very tense period. And my hope is that if he gets through that period, and he can be clear about who will be punished, who will not be punished, that then they can have a broader discussion. I think they certainly need a broader. Take something like the rule of law, which they claim they made progress at the fourth plenum. But the question is not what the legislation said, but how it's implemented. And for that to be done properly, it's going to take a lot more broad discussion, and they're not doing that. And so I think it's very troubling right now. That's my assessment. Thank you very much.